Today, I am so delighted to have with me Jessica Fein, the author of Breathtaking and the moderator of the podcast, I Don't Know How You Do It. And I have to say, I really don't know how you do it, Jessica. You've been through a lot and you have such a wealth of things to share. Thank you so much for being here on the podcast. Thank you for sharing your book, the stories in your book, Breathtaking. I'm about halfway through and I really, really enjoy it. You've got a lot to say, but you always have a great sense of humor in there, which is really nice when you're dealing with really heavy topics.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Fantastic. Well, would you start by introducing yourself?
Sure. So I'm Jessica Fein, as you said, and I am a writer who has just come out with my second book. My first book, I was way back in my 20s. And this is my memoir about raising, loving, and losing my daughter, primarily with a whole host of other losses along the way. I also was for decades until just a couple of months ago a senior executive in a corporate job. So I was definitely handling multiple roles. I have two other kids in addition to my daughter, whom I just mentioned. So I'm a mom of three. All my kids are adopted from Guatemala. My husband and I had a long and twisty road to parenthood that unexpectedly landed us in Guatemala, where we adopted our three children and subsequently discovered that our middle child had an ultra rare degenerative disease. She died 2 years ago, 1 week after her 17th birthday. So my story in Breathtaking is really about that road to parenthood and then our journey of loving and losing our daughter. It's really a book about her life, not about her death. In fact, it was actually completed and sold before she had died. So it was never intended to be a book about our loss of our daughter.
Oh, I love that. I love that. She sounds so vibrant and amazing.
Yeah, she was, and I will say that that's one of the gifts of writing, right? Because new people get introduced to her every day when they read the book, and that's so important to me because one of the things that's just such a huge tragedy is that the world doesn't get to know this unbelievable person. So through my writing, hopefully, and what I'm hearing from people is they're getting a really great sense of her, which makes me really happy. I want the world to know her and other people I've lost as well.
I love that. I love that you're saying that, and that is an important thing to to bring out. People who lose those who are close to them, they lose that sense of of everyone knowing how amazing they are. I
Exactly, exactly.
right?
There's so much, right? There's that. There's um, the way that person saw you is no longer here, and whether that's a parent, a sister, or a child, we each see each other in such unique ways, and so when that person is gone, nobody sees you in that precise way anymore, and that's a huge loss too that I think people don't necessarily appreciate until they've gone through it.
It's true. It's very true. I remember talking to my late husband about this, I am remarried, and my husband now is also widowed, and so we have a lot that we compare notes about. Sometimes people are afraid to talk to you about the person that you've lost,
Oh my God,
right?
right. They don't want to remind you as though we've forgotten, right? People are
Exactly.
uncomfortable. People don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. They don't want to bring up the person when all we want to do is talk about our person. That's the only
Yes,
way we get to spend time with them.
that is exactly right. That is exactly right. And I like that you bring that out. And this memoir is it's so honoring, not just to Dahlia, but you talk about your sister Nomi, your mom, your dad. Can you can you tell me about all of these people?
Yeah, well, yeah. So over the course of the book, there are a lot of losses. And I will point out, as you said, when you and I were chatting before, there's a lot of loss, but there's a lot of joy and love. And I'm very clear up front that this is not a book about death, but it's really a love story and also funny
Right.
because that's
Yeah.
how I roll. But my first loss was my sister Nomi. I was 27 and she was 30, and that was a sudden loss. And that's
Mm.
really the one that shaped all of the losses that came afterwards. And I think for anybody who's suffered multiple losses, we know that any of the losses after the first one are not losses in isolation, because the loss of the other people before absolutely plays into how we grieve. But when my
Right.
sister died, that was a real earth shattering time for me, because it was unexpected, and because we were so close in age, we were best friends. And there's such a unique relationship when you have a sibling who's also your best friend. So when she died, that really cracked my world open and changed my worldview very profoundly. And we had just celebrated her 30th birthday. We had to have 3 parties because she had so many friends, she couldn't fit them into just one party. Um,
Right.
and so that really did shape everything that came afterwards. And then the next big one was my mother, as you mentioned, and that was right in the middle of our adoptions. And so it was like she got to see a picture of my youngest kid, but she never met him because we hadn't brought him back from Guatemala yet. She got to take part
Right.
in his naming, but she never met
Right.
him. And so that, again, so much is wrapped up in that. Her not being able to get to know this magical, incredible human, and him not having that grandmother figure in his life. And then
Right.
over the course of our story, once we have our children and my daughter is diagnosed with Murph syndrome, my father and my eldest sister both died as well. So it is a lot. Most of the time when you talk to somebody who's lost an entire family, they were together at the time, like they were all in a car, right?
Right.
But
Right.
really one by one by one for 6 major losses in I'm not so young anymore, but I'm certainly not old enough to have sustained, that many losses. And so, it's a story of how we can carry on and integrate loss and continue to have a joyful and meaningful life.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. That is such an important message. I wanted to share something that really impacted me from the
So
book. This this you wrote, Nomi, about your sister Nomi. This is the first death, the one that you talk about as that pivotal first one. Nomi's death poked a massive hole in the bubble I'd lived in up to that point. I tried to patch it up, but it was no use. There would be many more less losses to come, each one shaped by that first one. I started to see the world not through the hazy sheen of my bubble, but through the clarity of the puncture.
yes, yeah.
Could you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, that really was the thing that changed my worldview. Nothing after that could ever really shock me, because I had had what I considered to be the greatest shock. And then I understood that it's a roulette wheel. I understood that anything can happen at any time, and it just really did change the way I saw everything, because before that, it was a little bit, sheltered. And look, I had had losses. I lost my stepfather and grandparents, etc. But those were more in the natural order of things. And this
Right.
one
I mean, your
was
sister
just
was
so shocking.
30.
She was 30. We had just been on the phone a couple hours earlier. It was like, it couldn't have been more unexpected. So, you emerge different after something like that.
That's true. Yeah, it's like this great loss of innocence.
Exactly. Exactly.
That is, yeah, yeah. Another thing that you had written about, because this happened very close to the time that you and your husband were married. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And this really stood out to me. Speaking of the day you got married, we had a lot to mourn the night we got married, but also a lot to celebrate. The sadness and the joy danced together, each perhaps more powerful because of the other.
Yeah, and that's something that I write and speak quite a bit about, which is how joy and grief, or happiness and sorrow, can mingle and can hold hands and live side by side. Most of the time, we imagine that if we are experiencing the single worst thing that can ever happen, we couldn't also find beauty or joy. And I submit that not only do those things live together, but they intertwined. Sometimes one of them shoulders the other out of the way, but they're always there together.
Mm. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I love that visual um, of a dance,
Mm-hmm.
of them dancing together. And it's true. I think it's true. It's hard to really go into the depths of sadness, divorced from the heights of joy. It's
Right.
almost
And for
like,
sure, vice versa. And once you've experienced the losses, they're always going to be there. It's always interesting when people are like, well, it's been a while, shouldn't you be over it? And it's like, no, we don't get over it, we integrate it.
no,
And so what does that look like when we integrate it?
exactly. That's exactly right. And so how did that look for you from the first loss to these multiple losses, but also at the same time, your family had a loss of any kind of semblance of normal life,
Yeah,
right?
quote unquote normalcy. I really did take the lead from my daughter, who more than anything had the right to be bitter and angry and fearful. Her disease was very insidious, and over 17 years, it took away her ability to breathe without a ventilator, to walk, to talk, to eat. And ultimately, she wasn't able to move at all for the last 2 years of her life.
Oh,
And
wow.
she wanted to be out in the world, experiencing things and having fun and being silly and being an amazing, amazing kid. And as the mom, it was up to me to really facilitate that and to learn from that and to see that, yes, all these horrific, and really, I don't use that word lightly, it was a horror show in many respects. But while all that was happening, we could have a great time, and we made sure that we did. You
What
only have
did that look like? Give me
so,
some
yeah, what
examples.
that looked like was saying, okay, you know what? We're not going to be able to go get on a plane, but we can go to Target today. And, you know, we're not going to do the family vacation, but boy, we can make this outing to Target feel like a real party, right? And so it's how do you do the little things in a way that feels much more celebratory? And when they are such a victory to be able to go out and actually do something like that, it does feel like it's worth celebrating. So maybe it looks like having it's nobody's birthday party and
Oh, I like
with
that.
some balloons and cake, or maybe it looks like going to the skateboard park and racing up and down the ramps in the wheelchair, or maybe it looks like just turning Dahlia's room into a movie theater with a big screen. And she couldn't eat popcorn, but she loved helping other people do it. And so there were so many ways that we looked to give all of our kids a childhood in the midst of a tragedy.
Right, right. How did your boys handle all of this?
It was a really complicated uh, situation for everybody involved in different ways. One of the things about grief, and this, make no mistake, was grief all along,
Hmm.
is people handle it in really different ways and may even handle it differently from day to day. So, they absolutely were magic in that they treated Dahlia like a regular sister to a certain extent.
Hmm.
And they also became pretty sophisticated medical providers. I mean, they were able to do a lot of things and to be really helpful. And they understood that they were not the first priority. Now, that's a really harsh thing to say, but we were saving our daughter's life every single day. So it was just a different kind of relationship.
Right, right. That makes a lot of sense. And do you find that your boys have more compassion?
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's the most compassionate, inclusive, understanding people, and maybe they would be otherwise. We'll never know. But for sure, they are who they are, at least in part because they're Dahlia's siblings.
Right, right. That makes a lot of sense to me. I know when I met my late husband, he had two little children, 6 and 9, and their mother had been sick for a while, and so I remember being very aware of how compassionate and kind that they were just as children,
Yeah.
and that I don't think it's necessarily naturally developed in most kids.
Yeah, I mean, you just have a totally different way of seeing things, and I mean, they adore their sister, so that gives them
Right.
more empathy for people who are disabled, for people who are suffering because they watched it up close with the person they loved most.
Right, right. And yet they knew her as a person,
Yeah,
not as a disabled person.
right.
Right. And so I think sometimes people looking in the window at somebody else's life might feel sorry for them or think, oh, that can't be a life worth living. And yet all of these joys, these relationships that you're talking about, just really kind of dispel that.
Exactly, exactly. And being up close to front row as you can be, really does change who you are.
Right. Do you think it gave you a different sense of what matters most, or was that always natural for you?
Oh, no, it absolutely changes. I mean, I am who I am because of all my kids, but in such a large part because of Dahlia and because of living on the precipice every single day. So, I mean, I'd go to work sometimes. I'd be at my desk at 8:30 and I will have quite literally saved my daughter's life that morning. And then other people are like, oh, my kid missed the bus. And so, it does give you a different sense of perspective.
Seriously, it's so true.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do you handle that kind of scenario? Like, do you roll your eyes, or is this also part of the understanding that they can't know what it's like? I mean,
It's both. On the one hand, it's like, okay, people can't win. Like, I know that they can't win because you don't want people to have to not tell you what's going on because they're like, well, this will never compare to your situation. So I'm not going to say anything. Who wants to live like that? On the other
right,
hand, it is like, are you kidding me? When they say my kid sprained their ankle doing a back flip or whatever.
right,
So, right. So I
yeah,
get it. People can't win. So I
right,
start with that understanding. There's
yeah,
no good way to be. But yeah, so I try and be understanding of that. And it depends how gracious I'm feeling at the moment because there are plenty of times when I'm like, are you kidding me? But I don't say it out loud.
right. No, that no, right, right. It's true. It's true. It's what
And look, I mean, I'll never forget when a friend of mine, her grandmother died. And it was shortly after my sister died. And my friend was having a rough time. And I said to my older sister, I was like, I can't, like, I'm finding it really hard to be there for her, for this friend whose
yeah,
grandmother had died, because I mean, the grandmother was like 80 something. And my sister Rachel
right.
said to me, look, this might be the hardest thing they've ever gone through. So you need to kind of, she was talking sense into me. She was like, get over there and, understand that. And I try most days I succeed to really believe that there's no such thing as a grief hierarchy.
Yes.
Some days it's easier than others.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's one of the things that I try to avoid too much going into how traumatic each person's passing was, because we tend to think that way.
Right.
Like, yeah, because we're thinking of the immediate trauma and tragedy of someone's death, which of course, when they're surrounded by their loved ones and, a light filled room, with soft music playing, you know, that it's human nature, I think, to try to compare. But I like what you're saying here, because you're right. What one person has experienced might truly be the hardest thing
Yeah.
that they've gone through, and ultimately, the the compassion and the empathy that comes from that is really powerful. That's what I think the world needs more of.
Right. Right.
Right. Um, I wanted to share another thing that you had said. This kind of speaks to what you're talking about. Um, your sister had passed away. Your mother had not passed away yet, but she must have been sick at this time when you wrote this. You said Ever since my sister Nomi died, I imagined as vividly as I could stand to the deaths of the people closest to me. I was so afraid of being caught off guard again that I wanted to be mentally prepared for losing someone else who was part of me. It was a stupid exercise at best, a twisted one at worst. Every time I considered what it might feel like to lose my mom, it felt like a hornet's nest exploded in my stomach. I let myself feel it for a bare minute and then quickly changed the ruminations in my head to think about something less painful, like world hunger. Thought that was funny. Then you went on. 1 week after we got back from Guatemala, my mother died. The hornet's nest exploded in my stomach, and the hornets had sharp quills that traveled through me, jabbing every inch of my intestines. Imagining the worst thing doesn't make you any more prepared when it happens.
Yeah. Right. I mean, I think we all do that, right? We think like, well, if I just, consider this strongly enough and think about it and imagine myself going through it, I'll be prepared. And that's just not the case. So we may as well not waste our time imagining it before it's actually here. 'Cause it's not going to
Yes,
help us make it any easier when the thing comes. It's just going to ruin the time leading up to it.
exactly. I totally agree. And it's something that I've had this conversation with people before when they start with, I just can't imagine. And I usually respond, you shouldn't. It's actually a gift that you can't imagine how it really feels because the pain in the moment will be enough.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think that that's true when we're thinking about our own potential situations. But I think if we
Right.
want to be present for other people, we need to be able to empathize. And if we don't even allow ourselves to imagine, then we can't fully be present for them. And when you say to somebody who's grieving, I can't imagine, what you're doing is you're shutting down the conversation and you're putting up a barrier between you and the griever. It's not helpful to the griever.
Right.
It just makes the griever feel more isolated.
That's right. That's a good point. Very good point.
Yeah. And when people say, I can't imagine it, I believe they can imagine. They just don't want to. So, because I get it every day, I can't imagine. I've gotten it at my people's funerals. I can't imagine.
Right.
So
Right. Right.
the problem is, if you think about it, there is no way to respond. If you are the griever and somebody says, I can't imagine, what are you supposed to say to that? Like literally, there's nothing to say. Okay.
Right.
I mean, I couldn't imagine it either before it happened, or, good for you that you don't have to imagine. So when we try and
Right.
consider how grief can bring us closer together rather than divide us, we need to be able to empathize. We need to be able to let grief be a bridge. We are all going to be grievers. So let's try to understand how we can be present in a more meaningful way, which begins with trying to imagine. And that's not comfortable, but it's not comfortable for the
Right.
griever either. And if you want to be there and be meaningful, maybe starting by trying to think about what that person is going through.
That's good. Yes, that's right. Even if, and of course, you can't walk right in their shoes, but you can walk alongside
Yeah,
and try to at least be there
right.
with them. So who could you really count on?
Well, I'm really so lucky that my husband and I were partners throughout all of this because, we know that more than half of couples with a child with special needs, let alone medically complex condition, split up. And then there are
Yeah.
plenty of people who go through this on their own.
Yeah.
So I'm lucky that my husband and I met when we were young. We had been through a lot together already. And so
Hmm.
by the time we were co parenting in this situation, we were both survivors.
Mm, yeah. Really best friend, each other's best
Yeah,
friend.
totally. Also, I have a lot of girlfriends who I've known my whole life, and that's very helpful because it's hard for people to get to know you once you've been through so many things because it's a lot of explaining.
Right. Yes, exactly. How does that work for you when you meet somebody? You are no longer, simple Jessica Fein who went
Mhm.
to college and met Rob and we got married and had kids.
Yeah.
How do
Well,
you
now I can just say read the book.
exactly? That's it's
Right? I'll be like, here's the book. Call me when you've read it and we can have coffee.
right, right. Do you find that it's is it ever too much for people? Do you find that
Oh
there's
God,
people?
yes. I mean, this is another thing. The grievers end up needing to like manage other people's emotions. For
Mm.
example, you run into somebody, you're in a new situation. They say, "How many kids do you have?" You say, "As I would,
Mm-hmm.
3." They say, "How old are they?" And then you've got to say, "Oh, I'm sorry. This is going to be tough. Sorry, I don't mean to catch you off guard. Sorry, sorry, sorry." You have to do it.
Uh-huh.
So,
Uh-huh.
as the griever, we manage other people's response to our grief.
Right. 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 So how do you do that well?
Yeah. I think that what is most important is to understand as the griever that it's up to you when you want to share, when you feel safe to share, when you're in the mood to share. And if you don't feel like it, you don't have to. And I mean, I write about this a lot. I have a column on grief and psychology today, and I did a whole piece on this, which is if you don't want to engage on it, don't feel guilty. You don't have to. It's your story to share when and how you want to.
That's right. That's right. And I think those who are really going to be there for you are comfortable with that.
Right.
And those who aren't, that's fine.
That's
They
fine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's fine. They'll find other friends, or they'll have their own experiences and it will
Yeah,
change them.
that's right.
So it's a really different experience what you and Rob and your boys had living with someone who was, I mean, we all have some expiration date, right? But for most of us, we go around with a little ambiguity about that.
Yeah.
What's it like to live day in and day out with someone who, as you said, you literally saved her life over and over again? How does that look? How does that
Yeah.
affect you?
I think that it does make some of the little stuff seem much littler, even.
Hmm.
So I do think it's a major perspective creator. And I think that it makes ordinary things feel somewhat extraordinary. Like I said, it's like a victory if you've made it successfully to the Home Depot and back. You know what I mean? And like had a successful
Right.
outing. That's a victory, right? You just think about things so differently. Also, you're much more tired than you would have ever imagined you could possibly be.
Yeah. Yeah. I bet.
A lot of exhaustion. I
I
mean,
bet.
because we had 8 years where my daughter was an eyes on patient, meaning that my husband or I or a nurse trained specifically in her care had to have our eyes on her 24/7. So, that was 8 years. It's a lot.
That it's so different. I mean, you expect that when you are caring for an infant, a
Oh,
newborn to some
exactly. And the
extent.
thing is,
But
yeah, when you have a baby, other people can help out in a different way. First of all,
yes,
it's joyous all the time. Second, I mean, not all the time, but you're like mesmerized by these
exactly.
little toes or whatever. And
Yes.
then your best friend can babysit or your sister, your mother, whatever. Nobody else
Yes.
could take care of Dahlia's medical needs. I mean, nobody else, unless you were trained in her care specifically,
Right.
literally. And also, we are accustomed to the physical demands of parenting to get less as we get older, right?
Yes. Right.
We went in the opposite direction. And that's
Right.
another way that my other children were involved because they were becoming stronger. So my daughter, to move her, required two people, and my eldest helped me all the time, every day. I couldn't do it, couldn't have done it alone, literally.
Mm. And they must miss her.
Oh yeah.
How
Yeah.
how do you guys as a family, how does that look around the dinner table? What's your typical now without her there?
Yeah, I mean, they're older now, so there's a lot of coming and goings with jobs and friends and school and whatever. So, it's not just like the four of us sitting with an empty chair every night around the table. Um, and, one of the things that I've learned is how we each grieve so differently. And
Yeah.
somebody might be in the throes of it one minute when somebody else is like in a different place. And so trying to respect where people are not just even generally, but day to day or hour to hour, because it does vary and it is waves.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. That's good. One thing that you said, and this was referring to Nomi, but makes me think of what you're talking here. You said, Nomi isn't here, and the presence of her absence will never go away.
Right. Right. Exactly. The absence can be such a gigantic presence, right? I mean, that is
Right.
100% of the time. There is not a minute that goes by that I am not carrying my family with me and feeling them.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think that's a pretty universal experience for people going through grief. And to know that that's normal,
Yeah. I
you
wouldn't want
know?
it any other way. I mean, I wouldn't want to not have them in, as part of me.
Right.
That's such an important part of who I am.
Exactly. Exactly.
And because
So,
I feel a responsibility to be sharing them with the world.
yes. Yes. And especially within your friends and family,
Right.
right? Right. So how do you celebrate her birthday or other milestones, things that you would have celebrated with her that now you
Yeah, well,
celebrate
it's an
with her?
interesting
Yeah.
question, because I remember how we changed that, which was when the first year after my sister Rachel died, I was really low and on her birthday, and my little guy Theo said, "Well, why aren't we getting cake? Let's get cake. Let's celebrate her." I mean, birthdays are about celebrating somebody's life. So even though it was like, you know, physical pain that she wasn't here to celebrate that particular birthday, the idea that we were going to celebrate her was so gorgeous. And so now that's something that we do for these birthdays, and I love it.
That's awesome.
It's a lot of cake.
That's great. That's
I
great.
know.
Well, okay, so now you are the sole living sister
Right.
of this original family of yours with three girls.
Yes.
And I know your sisters had children.
Yes.
So do you feel a sense of mothering over those children? What's that
I
relationship
mean, it
like?
is interesting. My Nomi's daughter was one when she died, and
Mm.
wasn't one when Nomi died, and she just turned 30. So she just turned
Oh
Nomi's
my
age.
goodness. Wow.
And she was adopted by her father's wife. So her father got remarried to a
Yeah.
fabulous, fabulous, fantastic woman, and she
Mm.
adopted my niece. So
Oh.
that's been a gorgeous thing. And my niece was raised as part of an incredible family with three new siblings who
Mm.
came along. And I feel so fortunate to be part of that
Oh,
family. And
beautiful.
adore my niece. I talk to her all the time. She's a major, major part of my life. Um, and my other sister's son is also a part of my life. That he was older; it wasn't quite the same.
Mhm.
But yeah, they're both very, very important to me. And I also want them to be close to me so that they can get any bits of my sisters that are part of me, that they can still
Yeah,
feel a connection that way.
that is so important, and not every family feels that or makes the room for that. Like your niece's uh,
I know.
mother, right? For
Well,
her
that was my
family,
mother said to me at the beginning, when my niece's father started dating. My mother said to me, "You better. We all need to include, the people he's dating,
yes,
the people because that's going to be our connection to my niece,
that's
and
right.
she was 100% correct. And like I said, he married somebody fabulous, and I'm so grateful that my niece got to grow up with that mother, even though it wasn't my sister.
Right, right. But to have lost her mother and then her mother's family would have been a double tragedy,
Right.
right? But not all people see it that way. And
Yeah. I
I
mean, it would
was
have been a
so
tragedy for me. I would have, if I lost
right,
my niece in addition. Right.
right. But
Yeah.
but also for her to not have
Yeah.
that connection to her birth mother,
Right.
your sister through that. When I when I married my late husband, his wife's family was amazing to me. They were
Hmm.
so welcoming, and I'm sure they had the same thoughts, this
Right.
to stay connected. And for me, my thought was, how could I separate these kids from the grandparents they'd always known, aunts and uncles, um, and it's, I mean, it's just more people to love them.
Exactly.
Right. And I was fortunate. My family was extremely loving and, embraced them. And, my dad ended up having a particularly close relationship with our oldest daughter, with, you know, my stepdaughter. It's just, it can only be better to
Exactly.
expand that circle. But again, it doesn't happen all the time. I have a friend who's widowed, and her late husband's family are still in such active grief that they have not been able to embrace her new husband and children, and it's just a loss. It
Yeah.
feels like a double loss.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to say it any other way. So can you delve a little bit into what role your faith or beliefs have played in this process that you have experienced?
Yeah. I don't think what I believe in or don't believe in has changed in a dramatic way. I will say that any opportunity for community, wherever that community comes from, is such a blessing when you're going through some kind of suffering. And so, I mean, the beauty of most religions is that there's the built in community element. And
Yeah.
so, specifically, for example, in Judaism, we have very strong rituals around grief, and that can be comforting because we know we know what to expect. We understand that it's a community responsibility, really, to
Yeah.
show up for the grief, or at least in the immediate aftermath. Now, I will tell you, day 8 after the official Shiva ends sucks, but
Yeah.
the first 7 days are quite nice because you just don't have to worry about being you know, feeling the void. People show up, and at least their presence is, you know, staves off the intense loneliness that often comes with grief.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I agree with you. That is a great. That's one of the great benefits, like you said, of having a community, and
Yes,
especially I mean, there are all kinds of communities that come together for people, during times of crisis, but especially a faith community that has written or unwritten expectations.
exactly.
It can be very comforting. Can you explain what Shiva is?
Sure. And I mean, I'm not a particularly religious person, so I'm sure
Mhm.
any of your listeners who are would talk about a lot of the kind of rules around Shiva, and there
Mhm.
are a whole host of them. But essentially, what it means is typically for 7 days after you've lost somebody, more your friends and family will come to comfort the mourner in their home. It's called sitting Shiva,
Mm.
and so people come, and typically you might have a brief prayer ceremony in the morning, and in the evening people would come for those in particular. You can't in Judaism have that kind of prayer service without at least 10 adults. So that's
Mhm.
considered a real blessing to show up for somebody else and to help make that
Right.
10. And they're going to bring the food, and they're going to clean up, and they're going to make sure that, your freezer's full and all of that. So for
Mm.
7 days, the community really wraps its arms around the griever.
That is fantastic. That is a wonderful, wonderful tradition.
Yeah.
And that can be adapted to all kinds of circumstances. People can borrow that and say, that is a great idea Let's
Yeah.
do that. Let's do that
Well,
as neighbors with our,
right.
with our neighbor who just lost their son, or,
Hmm.
with our daughter's fourth grade class. you
Yeah.
know you that's really, I love that. I was fortunate to be part of a strong faith community, and so, very similar people came in. They came to us, right?
Yes.
Brought brought food, brought flowers, shared a lot of love and consideration.
Yeah. But
Um,
as if you're trying to support somebody who's grieving, I would say be in it for the long haul, because remember that the community will descend in the immediate aftermath. But what happens on day 8 or year 2 can be just as hard.
that's exactly right. That's right, and that's tricky, right?
Yeah.
Because and especially, now I'm acquainted with a lot of grievers,
Hmm.
and even for me, it can be hard to remember and put myself back
Yeah.
into that, because there are parts of me that are moving on as well,
Right.
right?
Right.
Do you find that?
Um, yes. And I try to really practice what I preach, so to speak.
Hmm.
And it's not easy. I mean, it is
Right.
uncomfortable and it is hard and it is inconvenient and it is the most important thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. I wanted to share. I wanted to share one more quote from your book, and you'll have to help me with the pronunciation
Okay.
of this. This is from your dad. You said, at every Passover Seder or Seder.
Later.
At every Passover Seder, my father read from a piece he wrote. How do we keep hope alive? The tradition teaches that we are. This is where I need your help.
Okay.
Asiri Tikva.
Good job. Australia. That's great. It's great.
Asiri Tikva. We are Asiri Tikva, prisoners of hope. Hope is a curious prison, a prison without walls. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. That is what it means to be a prisoner of hope. This is what you said. But hope didn't feel like a prison to me. The absence of hope seemed far more punishing. And yet, hope on its own felt too passive. I wasn't willing or able to sit back and let hope or luck steer the way.
Right. Exactly. I mean, look, I still believe very strongly in hope and don't want to be a person without hope. But I think that hope by itself doesn't have much doesn't have much legs, right? So it's hope and action put together, and I think if you do that, then you've got a fighting chance.
Right, right. And what I love that you bring out over and over again in your book, though, is you used that hope with legs, right? Hope and action. And it seems to me there was a transformation from the feeling that hope and action could help create a certain outcome, to
Hmm.
maybe hope and action for its own sake
Yeah,
was
that's
the,
very true. That's a
the
really, really interesting point. Thank you for getting that, because nobody else has put it quite that way. But that's right. I wasn't going to personally cure my daughter's disease. I thought I could, you know, but I couldn't.
right,
And I'm not a
right,
scientist and I'm not a researcher. And there are very smart people who are trying to, work on this. And, we tend to think we're going to be able to fix things. And there are some things that are unfixable. And there are other things we can do in those situations, and they do require that cocktail of hope and action.
right, right. It's a really, really vital piece, I think, of what you're able to share
Yeah.
in Breathtaking.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you so much for spending the time with me and talking about these people you love and talking about what you've learned, how you've changed, how you've grown. I really, really appreciate you setting aside this time. And I am so excited about finishing the book. I've been glued to it for the last few days.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. And yes, I hope people will check it out wherever you like to get your books, Breathtaking. by Jessica Fein, and you can get it at Amazon or bookshop.org or your local
Yeah.
library. So definitely check it out. Oh yeah, and if people want to check out my podcast, it's called I Don't Know How You Do It.
Yes. Yes. I am excited to go there next.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Well, Jessica, before we finish, I want to ask you the question I ask all of my guests, my final question. What do you think it means to grieve well?
I think grieving well means giving yourself permission to feel what you're feeling when you're feeling it, not to have expectations of, quote, right and wrong, should and shouldn't, but to be able to integrate it into your life in the way that feels right for you.
Absolutely. I love it. Thank you again so
Thank
much.
you.
Jessica Fein, author of Breathtaking, podcast host of I Don't Know How You Did It, How You Do It. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. I appreciate it.